Hello and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, I have a treat for you guys, a minty treat for you guys. I'm going to review the latest version of Linux Mint, specifically the Cinnamon edition. Linux Mint 21 features the latest version of Cinnamon, and it's been synced to the latest Ubuntu base as well. It's based on Ubuntu 22.04, so it actually has the stability of an LTS distribution because its base is LTS or long-term supported, which is great. And although I ran into a few issues, Linux Mint 21 was a treat to review and I quite enjoyed it. So what I'm going to do is give you guys a full review in this video. And Linux Mint has been a longtime favorite of quite a few people within my audience. So I think this is going to be a video that you guys are going to be excited to watch. If nothing else, I had a lot of fun making it and I can't wait to get into the review. Now, before I do need to mention a few things. The first is the sponsor for this video, Linode. And Linode has been a sponsor of Learn Linux TV for actually longer than I can remember. It's been a number of years. And Linode is actually something that I've been using since before they became a sponsor. So when they asked to become a sponsor, it was a no-brainer. I was already using their service and I was already familiar with it. Using their platform, you can spin up your very own cloud Linux server in minutes. And that makes sense because Linode is a Linux-focused cloud server provider. They live and breathe Linux. And all of the related technologies, such as block storage, object storage, DNS, Kubernetes, you name it, are all a part of their platform. If you don't already have an account yet, then you could use the URL that you see on the screen right now. That's actually going to tell Linode that you heard about them from Learn Linux TV, which helps support the channel. But what you get in return for doing that is you'll get $60 in credit towards your new account, and you could use that credit to spin up all kinds of Linux servers because they have servers that start at just $5 a month. So do the math. You can spin up quite a few servers. The credit is actually good for 60 days, so you can spin up a bunch of servers and create your own army of servers if you wanted to. But if you don't know what you should use your Linode servers for, one easy thing that you could use them for is to use them as test subjects or test servers while you go through the countless tutorials that are available on this channel. Maybe you might want to learn Debian or Ubuntu or CentOS, even Arch. They have all of those distributions, among others, on their platform. And the fact that they have Arch Linux on their platform as an option means that you can legitimately tell all of your friends, I run Arch, and actually be telling the truth. You could be running Arch on a server, of all things, on Linode's platform, and that's crazy. It's also a lot of fun. So definitely check out Linode. I really appreciate them sponsoring this channel yet again. That was really nice of them to do that. I love their platform, so it's a great fit for me and my company, and I think you're going to like it a lot too. Now with that out of the way, another thing that I would like to mention is that my new book, Mastering Ubuntu Server, is available right now, specifically the 4th edition of Mastering Ubuntu Server. This book has just come out, and I can't wait for you to read it, so definitely check it out. And it's available right now on Amazon, among other websites. If you go to ubuntuserverbook.com, you'll see links to places that you can order the book from, and I would really like it if you checked it out. I put a lot of work into this book, and I think you're going to love it. So if you're looking for a book about Ubuntu Server and you want to learn the finer points of Linux administration, then definitely check out this book, and I hope you love it. If nothing else, if you're looking for an Ubuntu Server book, then this one might be up your alley. Anyway, I'm really excited to show you guys Linux Mint 21 and get into the review, so let's go ahead and get started. And here's Linux Mint 21, the Cinnamon edition, in all its glory. This release of Linux Mint features the latest version of Cinnamon as well, version 5.4. But what you're seeing right now is the default unchanged desktop that you'll get when you install the Cinnamon edition of Linux Mint 21. Now again, I will be showing you some of the new features in this release, but before I do, I just want to take a moment to talk about the installation process, which hasn't really changed all that much. But if you haven't seen it before or you're curious what the installer is like, let's go ahead and check that out. So just like previous releases of Linux Mint, we have a live mode that we could use to try Linux Mint before we install it, and that's always a great idea. You definitely don't want to install a new operating system if you're not even sure if it's going to work on your hardware. So do me a favor and always try live mode first if you're checking out a new Linux distribution. And the reason for that is because if there's going to be any hardware incompatibilities or anything like that, then you'll know as soon as you try it out in live mode. Once you've had a moment to try out live mode, you could double click on the icon that's right there on the desktop. That'll launch the installer. And once that comes up, the process is simple. You just go from one screen to the next, filling out any information that might be required or making whatever selection is required on each of those screens. And you navigate all the way through. And then at the end, it'll start installing. Once you log in for the very first time, a welcome screen will show up that gives you quick access to various things to get you started. For example, there's quick access to various applications. Also, we have quick access to support channels such as IRC, documentation, and things like that. So the welcome screen is a great addition, and none of the things that I've mentioned so far are new as of Linux Mint 21. The installation process might have seen some refinements, but for me, it looks pretty much the same as it always has, and that's not really a bad thing. I feel like it's a very good installer, and it gets the job done. And the installation didn't take all that long. I mean, it might have been 5 minutes. It didn't quite feel like 5 minutes. It actually felt like 2 or 3 minutes. But then again, this system is no slouch. As you can see, we have a bunch of CPUs, plenty of RAM, and although this isn't really the best NVIDIA card by any stretch, it's actually quite old, it's effective, it works. So this system right here actually handles Cinnamon very well, but I would expect it to. But overall, the installation process was fast. Before I knew it, I was up and running. After installation was done, the first thing that I decided to do was the right thing to do when you first install an operating system. I wanted to install all of the updates. Well, actually, that wasn't the first thing that I ran into. I'll get to that later. But anyway, I did install all of the updates as soon as I was logged in. So all I had to do was click on the Update Manager icon that's present in the System Tray area of the panel at the bottom. Once you open that up, it'll show some basic information. I just clicked OK. And then it told me that there was a new version of the Update Manager itself, so I just went ahead and took care of that. And after I installed that update, the Update Manager itself restarted. That was really quick. And then it gave me a list of updates that I could install on my system. And since I just installed this, there were quite a few. In fact, there were 91 updates available. So as you can see, pretty much everything saw an update here. So what I did was I just went ahead and installed everything. Anyway, the updater is very effective and straightforward as well, so I don't feel like anyone's going to have a problem with the updater. But all things considered, I felt like it was a very reasonable experience when it comes to updating your system. So I just let it run, and once it was finished, I went ahead and restarted my computer. Now, one of the bigger changes in the new version of Cinnamon is a change that you're probably not going to notice, but will definitely result in good things to come. And specifically, I'm referring to changes in the window manager. The Muffin window manager, which is the component that the Cinnamon desktop uses to show windows on your screen, has actually seen quite a few under the hood improvements, and the Muffin window manager itself was forked from the GNOME desktop. GNOME desktop itself uses Mutter, so Mutter was forked and became the Muffin window manager. But there's been some things done behind the scenes with the window manager that's not going to be immediately apparent to you. You'll probably notice some performance improvements if you have a slower system, for example. But then again, you'll probably always notice performance improvements because that's something that the developers are always working on. But speaking of performance, the performance has been fine. I've not had any issues with performance. Everything is very responsive. We can see that there's not a whole lot going on, and that makes sense. I haven't even opened an application yet. So what you're seeing is the idle performance of the Cinnamon desktop. Now, a lot of people will ask me about memory usage. In this case, we have 2.3 gigabytes of memory being used, but that's not really important as much as people think it is because unused RAM is wasted RAM. So if nothing else, we could actually argue that the memory usage could be a little bit higher than it is. The more things that you have cached in RAM, the more performant your desktop is going to be. And anything that's cached on a Linux system isn't going to take away from applications because the kernel will free up memory for applications that need the memory. And that's one of the reasons why I don't usually mention memory usage when it comes to desktop environments, because that gives people the wrong impression. For example, somebody might call GNOME a resource-heavy desktop environment, which is absolutely untrue. If it is using more memory, it's because it's being efficient. Again, if an application needs memory, memory will be freed and provided to that application. But here we can see that it's actually making good use of the resources. When it comes to the CPU, there's not a whole lot going on. And unlike RAM, you can't really say that unused CPU is wasted CPU. I mean, maybe someday that might be a thing, but actually everything is pretty much idle, so there's that. And all of the applications in general just seem to launch very quickly. So here's Firefox, for example. But overall, Linux Mint 21 is very responsive. Now, another thing that I noticed that was really cool, and it's not the first time that I've noticed this, but I wanted to mention it, is that when I was actually recording a different video, I was using the Cinnamon installation for this review for a different video some time back, but while I was recording that video, my recording was interrupted because I forgot to check the Do Not Disturb option, and a message came up letting me know that my printer was detected and ready for use. Now that's actually not a new thing. Printing in Linux has been easier than on Windows for as long as I can remember. If you have a printer that's supported by Linux, then it's just going to be set up automatically. If you plug in a USB cable, in the case of a USB printer, it's going to automatically set it up. In my case, I had a network printer, and that was detected and set up automatically. Pop! OS, Ubuntu, and other distributions do this as well. But in Linux Mint 21, there's been some improvements when it comes to printing behind the scenes. More specifically, Linux Mint 21 utilizes the IPP protocol, which is a driverless protocol for supporting printers. Now, I'm pretty sure that in previous reviews of Linux Mint that I've done on the channel, that my printer has been set up automatically. So I don't even think that the ability for a printer to be automatically set up in Linux Mint 21 is a new feature. The release notes actually kind of word it as if it is a new feature, but it's not. But since the release notes actually mentions improvements to the printing system, I figured I would actually mention that to you guys as well. And when it comes to printing, I had no issues at all. Again, it was automatically set up. I didn't have to do a thing. Now, it did take a few minutes after I started for the first time, before that printer was detected and installed. But the very fact that Linux Mint did that for me, it set it up for me, that was really cool. I don't know about you, but I really dislike printers, and I especially dislike managing printers. When it comes to us IT people, we cringe equally when DNS is mentioned and printing is mentioned, because if you have a problem, it's always DNS. And printing is a problem in and of itself. You know, between paper jams and your ink running out, it's just tedious. But thankfully, the installation of your printer is not something that you have to deal with if you have a supported printer. Again, Linux Mint will do everything in its power to set that up for you, and that's really cool. Now, another new feature here in Linux Mint is another new feature that's actually not technically new, because wallpapers, which is what I'm going to talk about right now, are always improved upon, but the wallpapers in this release are new, and actually they come from a number of people that have provided artwork to the Linux Mint project, and we can see some of those wallpapers right here. And I really enjoy these wallpapers. It actually kind of makes me feel a bit sad that when I use a computer, I have a bunch of applications open, so I wouldn't be able to enjoy the wallpapers as much as I would like to, but having really cool wallpaper is a great thing. And the fact that they had artists submit their wallpaper to the project is actually benefiting the community and getting the community more involved, and that's really cool too. Another thing that I really like about the Cinnamon desktop is how customizable it is. It may not be as customizable as, say, the Plasma desktop environment, but it's not too far off. For example, if I click on Themes, just like in previous releases, because the ability to change themes is not new, I just wanted to mention that for those of you that haven't seen my previous review. I really like the fact that we could change the color scheme for basically every component of the desktop. So I just changed the color of the icons. That's pretty cool. And I could also transition to more of a dark theme, but I think you get the point. We have quite a few options for customizing the look and feel of the various components here in Cinnamon. That's really cool. Now, another application that I would like to spend some time talking about is Timeshift. And Timeshift actually undergone a bit of a change recently. But let's go ahead and open it up and then we'll talk about it. And Timeshift is an application that I'm extremely happy is included by default. I feel like a backup solution should be included on every Linux distribution, but this is more than just a backup solution. When I think of a backup solution, I think of something that's going to, well, back up my files. And yeah, that's a very important thing. And you can do that with Timeshift, but Timeshift is also able to create snapshots of your entire system. And that's really great because you could try software, for example, and evaluate software. And if for some reason you want to remove that piece of software, sure, you can uninstall that software, but even better is to roll your system entirely back to before that particular piece of software was installed. That's a very common use case when it comes to Timeshift. Anyway, at the very beginning, it's going to ask you if you want to enable rsync or ButterFS mode. I don't actually have ButterFS on my system, so that option was grayed out. And then it gives you the ability to choose where you want your snapshots to go. I'm not going to go too much into detail here because I have an entire video about Timeshift. But Timeshift is a really cool application and something that I highly recommend you check out and use to create a regular backup of your entire system. It's just a good idea. Now, one downside that I ran into when it comes to Timeshift is that I didn't see an option during my test to use ZFS snapshots for snapshots. The way I see it, if ZFS is offered as an option during installation, then it would be really nice if Timeshift actually supported that and could hook into ZFS and use that for snapshots. But I'm not going to be harsh on Linux Mint for not supporting that because Timeshift is something that went through a bit of a change, like I mentioned. Actually, the Linux Mint community took over development of Timeshift, so it's possible that if they didn't do that, we might not even have Timeshift anymore. But the fact that the Linux Mint developers are taking this application under their wing to manage it and guide it and develop it, that might mean that we'll get features like that in the near future. I can only hope. So for now, I'll just go ahead and put a question mark on this one. It's something that I hope they support, and maybe they will. But for right now, the options that we do have here are welcome. Now, when it comes to Linux Mint under the hood, let's go ahead and take a look around. So we can see that, of course, we're running Linux Mint 21, codenamed Vanessa, as you can see here. And this particular release of Linux Mint features Linux kernel 5.15, which is actually going to be the same kernel that its base, Ubuntu 2204, is using because Linux Mint is based on LTS Ubuntu under the hood. So that makes sense. So we have a newer kernel and newer software across the board. We have a newer version of Cinnamon. And while we may not have a bunch of new features here, we do have a lot of new tweaks all over the place here, but we don't have much in the way of killer features. But then again, a new release of Linux Mint is a new beginning because future releases of Linux Mint, for the near future at least, will be based on the same Ubuntu base. So the first release of a new version of Linux Mint is the synchronization of Linux Mint to that new base. And then from there, you might see additional features being added to the distribution as time goes on. But when it all comes down to it, at least for the most part, Linux Mint 21 is very solid, and I really enjoyed my time with it. I did, however, run into a few issues. Nothing too extreme or anything like that, nothing that would make me not want to recommend this to you guys, because I could already tell you that I definitely recommend Linux Mint 21. You should definitely check it out. But there were a few rough edges. In my case, I have a 4K display, and when I booted this new version of Linux Mint from live mode, and also the installed version as well, the default DPI, the default scaling basically, is so low that most of the screen elements were completely unreadable. The font was so small I had to get really close to the monitor, and I really just don't understand why this is still a problem. I mean, desktop environments largely have this figured out. They'll set a default scaling of 200%, for example. If you don't like that, you could always scale that down. But at the very least, you don't have to worry about everything being unreadable when you first launch your newly installed system. And to be honest, when it comes to issues that surround high DPI displays, it's actually getting a little bit irritating to me. I mean, we've had high DPI displays for so long now that I really can't believe that high DPI support is an issue on any desktop environment in existence today. And Cinnamon is a really good desktop environment. I quite like it. So the fact that the defaults didn't even take into account the fact that I had a 4K display and everything was really small, that feels like a problem that we probably should have ran into like 10 years ago. But here we are in 2022 with Cinnamon still having trouble, at least by default anyway, with high DPI displays. Now, to be fair, it only takes a few minutes to go into your control panel and then adjust your display settings, well, maybe longer than a few minutes because it's really hard to navigate the control panel and choose different settings if you can't read the screen in the first place, or you have to squint to see the really small text that's there by default. But once I did set the default resolution, I was actually in good shape. But actually, before I could even set the display settings with the installed version, I ran into another problem. And that problem had to do with the proprietary NVIDIA driver. Now, as an aside, the proprietary NVIDIA driver is a problem in and of itself. I think I speak for the majority of Linux users out there when I say that I'm frustrated with NVIDIA in general because they really can't seem to get their drivers right. So when it comes to NVIDIA, I had to manually install the proprietary NVIDIA driver. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, and it's kind of not because there's a drivers app in Linux Mint that is dedicated specifically for this purpose. However, when it comes to Linux Mint, it's known for the fact that it sets up things by default in a very good way such that you shouldn't run into any problems. So whatever the ideal settings are for your computer, Linux Mint has generally done a great job of that. For example, in the past, they would enable multimedia codecs by default, which is really great. That used to be a bigger problem, 10 or 20 years ago than it is today. But Linux Mint was among the first distributions to actually support multimedia codecs and get that set up for you right out of the box. And things being set up well out of the box is a really good selling point when it comes to Linux Mint. So if Linux Mint is a distribution that's known for setting up things properly out of the box, then why didn't it set up the NVIDIA driver? I mean, it is a thing with most distributions that you have to do that manually, but with Linux Mint, the expectations are a little bit different because it's supposed to be easier to use, easier for beginners, and it is actually easier to use and easier for beginners, but not when it comes to NVIDIA apparently, because it seems like they've made the decision not to install that driver for you out of the box and make you install that yourself. Now, you might be wondering why that's even a big deal. I mean, if I could simply just launch the drivers app and then manually install the NVIDIA driver right from there, and then after I reboot the system, have a fully enabled NVIDIA GPU, then what's the issue here? Well, the issue here is that after I installed Linux Mint and then I logged in to my desktop immediately after installing it, Cinnamon crashed. It froze. It was completely unresponsive for probably 5 minutes or something like that. And then it eventually did start responding just to let me know that due to a lack of hardware acceleration, Cinnamon can't run well, and as a result of that, Cinnamon crashed. Now, that wouldn't have been a big deal at all if all I had to do was just open up the drivers app and select the NVIDIA driver and reboot. I had to navigate crash messages to get to the drivers app just to do that, and I feel like a desktop that crashes by default if you don't have the NVIDIA driver installed creates a negative experience, and especially a negative first impression for Linux users, and that's not something that Linux Mint can afford. It's known for being an easy-to-use, out-of-the-box distribution, but with this version right here, it's kind of not. Not only did I need to manually correct the DPI settings so I could even read the screen in the first place, I had to suffer a crash of Cinnamon just to enable the driver to make it not crash anymore. So I kind of feel like it would have made a lot more sense if the Linux Mint developers just made sure that the NVIDIA driver was configured by default. I mean, that's what they're known for, right? So why did they change that? Well, it is what it is. After I went through all of that and got the NVIDIA driver set up and then manually adjusted my resolution settings, I was good to go. Sure, there were some rough edges at the very beginning, but after I got through those rough edges, I didn't run into any other problems. Everything worked out just great. So if you end up having the same problems that I had, then all you have to do is just set your resolution, maybe install an NVIDIA driver. If you have an NVIDIA GPU, reboot your system, and you should be good to go. And once you do reboot your system and everything is set up, then again, what you're left with is an incredible desktop experience because Linux Mint is a great distribution. Cinnamon is also a great desktop environment. And while there might not be like a bunch of extremely noticeable new features here, the focus with this new version seemed to be aligning the distribution to the latest Ubuntu base, the latest version of Cinnamon, and there's been additional changes from top to bottom that you may or may not notice. But what you're going to end up with is a refined experience, and if you like Linux Mint, especially the Cinnamon edition already, then you're going to continue to like it a lot with this release. But if you're not a fan of Cinnamon, or Linux Mint for that matter, then you're still not going to be a fan of either with this new release because it doesn't really change anyone's opinion. It's just Linux Mint being Linux Mint. And it's slightly better at being Linux Mint. Display and GPU issues aside, there's a lot of refinements like I've mentioned, and all of that combined, and also combined with the speed and performance of this desktop environment, I think you're really going to love it and it's worth a shot. So definitely consider checking it out. And that about does it for this review. Linux Mint, even though it has a few rough edges, is actually a really good distribution, and I recommend that you try it out. I love the Cinnamon desktop. It's actually one of my favorites, so it was a lot of fun trying out Cinnamon again. It's actually been a while, so catching up with Cinnamon was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed my time with Linux Mint. It was great. Anyway, thank you guys so much for checking out this review. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this review, then please click that like button, which might lead this video to show up for other people that might also enjoy this video. And if nothing else, definitely subscribe because I have some awesome videos coming very soon, and I can't wait for you to see those videos. I can't really say too much right now, but there's some really cool things coming, trust me. Click that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.